The day I discovered the truth about my inheritance, my wife Sandra was in bed with my best friend Richard, celebrating what they thought was my complete downfall. They had no idea that the broke loser they'd been treating like their personal servant had just inherited a billion-dollar empire. Sandra thought she was so clever, making me cook, clean, and run errands while she lived off my family's money that she believed belonged to her family. For 3 years, I endured their mockery, their demands, their cruel laughter behind my back. They called me worthless, a failure, a burden they graciously allowed to exist in their house. What they didn't know was that my grandfather, the oil tycoon they thought had disowned me, had been watching everything from the shadows. Every humiliation, every cruel word, every moment they treated me like dirt, while spending what they assumed was their fortune. The will reading was today, and I had let them believe they would inherit everything while I got nothing. Sandra had already planned my divorce papers, and Richard had been house shopping with my wife, picking out their dream home with what they thought would soon be their money. But as I stood in that lawyer's office, listening to them read my grandfather's final words, I realized that every moment of suffering had been a test. Every time I chose dignity over revenge, every time I stayed silent when they mocked me, every time I continued to love Sandra despite her cruelty, I was proving I deserved what was coming. The 3 years of hell were about to become their nightmare, and mine was finally ending. They thought they were getting rid of the broke husband and weak friend. They had no idea they were about to face the billionaire they'd created through their own cruelty. My name is Joseph, and 3 years ago I was a man who believed love could conquer anything. I married Sandra thinking she was the woman of my dreams, intelligent, beautiful, and ambitious. We had been college sweethearts, and when my grandfather supposedly cut me off for marrying beneath my station, Sandra stood by me. At least, that's what I thought was happening. Sandra came from the ambitious Harrison family, known for their social climbing and business connections. Her sister Juanita was everything Sandra wished she could be: successful, ruthless, and married to wealth. Sandra always lived in Juanita's shadow, constantly trying to prove she was just as capable, just as deserving of the finer things in life. When we got married, Sandra thought she was getting a trust fund husband who would elevate her status. When my grandfather allegedly disowned me, she didn't just feel disappointed, she felt humiliated. Richard had been my best friend since childhood. We grew up together, shared everything, and when he started struggling financially, I welcomed him into our home without question. He was charming, handsome, and had a way of making everyone around him feel special. I thought his friendship with Sandra was natural, they got along well, shared interests, and I was happy my wife and best friend could be close. What I didn't realize was that my grandfather, Thomas Montgomery, had orchestrated the entire situation. The disownment was fake, a test he designed to see who I really was and who truly cared about me. For 3 years, he secretly funded our lifestyle through shell companies and anonymous investments, all while watching how Sandra and Richard treated me when they thought I had nothing. Our daily routine became a nightmare disguised as a marriage. Sandra would wake up and immediately start giving me tasks like I was hired help. Joseph, the kitchen needs cleaning. Joseph, pick up my dry cleaning. Joseph, Richard needs a ride to his job interview. She never asked, always commanded, and if I hesitated even slightly, she would explode into tears about how difficult her life had become because she married a failure. Richard played his role perfectly, acting like he was doing me a favor by staying with us, while constantly undermining my confidence. You know, buddy, Sandra deserves better than this. Look at this tiny apartment, look at how she has to struggle. If you really loved her, you'd find a way to give her the life she deserves. He would say this while eating food I bought, wearing clothes I paid for, and sleeping in the guest room of the apartment I maintained. The psychological manipulation was masterful. They made me believe that I was lucky they tolerated me, that any other woman would have left long ago, that Richard was a saint for maintaining a friendship with such a disappointment. They isolated me from other friends, dismissed my job prospects, and made me feel like supporting them was the least I could do to make up for ruining Sandra's life by not being rich. Sandra's transformation from loving wife to cold manipulator was gradual but complete. She stopped saying, "I love you," and started saying, "I'm trying to love you despite everything." She stopped physical affection and started treating intimacy like a reward I had to earn through service. She stopped including me in decisions and started making plans with Richard that I only learned about when I was expected to facilitate them. The cruelest part was how they maintained the facade in public. At family gatherings, Sandra would play the devoted wife, talking about how difficult things were but how she was standing by her man. Juanita would offer sympathy while secretly gloating that her sister had married down. Richard would play the supportive best friend, always there to help the struggling couple, while neighbors and friends praised him for his loyalty. But in private, the mask came off completely. Sandra would openly discuss how much better her life would be without me, how Richard understood her in ways I never could, and how she was only staying married out of pity. Richard would agree, adding that he was only staying friends to support Sandra through this difficult time. They talked about me like I wasn't there, planned their future like I wouldn't be in it, and treated me like a temporary inconvenience they had to endure. The irony was that every dollar they spent trying to maintain appearances, every luxury they sacrificed to afford, every opportunity they claimed I had cost them, was actually being funded by the grandfather they thought had abandoned me. Thomas Montgomery was watching his test play out, seeing how his potential heir handled adversity, and how the people around him revealed their true characters when they thought he had nothing to offer them. For 3 years, I chose love over pride, service over rebellion, and hope over despair. I kept believing that if I just tried harder, loved deeper, and proved my worth through actions instead of words, Sandra would remember why she married me, and Richard would remember our friendship. I was wrong about their capacity for change, but right about something more important. I was becoming the man my grandfather hoped I could be, even though I had no idea he was watching. The real betrayal began on what should have been our 3rd wedding anniversary. I had saved for months to buy Sandra a necklace she'd admired in a jewelry store window. It wasn't expensive by the standards she'd grown accustomed to before our financial problems, but it represented weeks of skipping lunch and walking instead of taking the bus. I planned a romantic dinner at home, thinking that perhaps this gesture would remind her of the love we once shared. When I presented the gift, Sandra's reaction wasn't gratitude, it was disgust. She examined the necklace with the expression of someone who'd been handed garbage, then looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Joseph, this is what you think I'm worth? This cheap little trinket from some discount store?" Her voice was cold, clinical, like she was diagnosing a disease. "Do you see what my sister's husband buys her? Do you see how other men treat their wives?" Richard, who had somehow materialized for our anniversary dinner without invitation, immediately jumped to Sandra's defense. "Come on, man, you know Sandra has refined taste. This isn't really her style, is it?" He picked up the necklace and examined it like he was an expert appraiser. "Maybe you should have asked me first. I understand what women like Sandra actually want." That was the moment I realized they had been discussing me, analyzing my failures, and planning my replacement long before this conversation. The way Richard spoke about Sandra's preferences, the way Sandra looked to him for validation of her criticism, the way they seamlessly supported each other in tearing me down, it was choreographed. They had been having these conversations without me, making these judgments together, and I was just now seeing the result. Sandra continued her assault on what I thought was a romantic gesture. "You know what this represents to me, Joseph? It represents how little you understand about who I am, what I need, what I deserve. Any man who truly loved me would know that I can't wear something like this to the events I attend, the places I need to be seen. You're asking me to wear a symbol of your failure." The cruelest part was how she delivered this speech while Richard nodded sympathetically, like he was witnessing a tragedy beyond anyone's control. "She's not being unreasonable, buddy," he said, placing what I thought was a supportive hand on my shoulder. "Sandra has a position to maintain, an image to uphold. You have to think about these things from her perspective." I tried to defend my gift, explain the sacrifice behind it, share the love that motivated it, but every word I spoke seemed to make things worse. Sandra interpreted my explanation as excuses, Richard saw my emotion as weakness, and together they transformed what I intended as romance into evidence of my inadequacy as a husband and provider. "You spent months saving for this?" Sandra asked, incredulous. "Do you know what that tells me? It tells me that in months of planning, this was the best you could do. It tells me that your best effort results in something I'm embarrassed to be seen wearing. It tells me that you still don't understand the kind of woman you married." Richard reinforced every criticism Sandra made, but he did it with the tone of a concerned friend trying to help me understand reality. "Look, Joseph, I care about both of you. Sandra isn't being cruel, she's being honest. She married you expecting a certain kind of life, and you're asking her to accept less and less every year. That's not fair to her." The anniversary dinner became an intervention where my wife and best friend explained all the ways I had disappointed them, all the sacrifices they had made for my failure, and all the reasons Sandra would be justified in leaving me. They tag-teamed their assault, with Sandra providing the emotional devastation, and Richard offering the logical analysis of why she was right to feel devastated. Other wives don't have to work as hard as I do to make ends meet, Sandra explained. Other wives don't have to explain to their friends why their husbands can't provide basic things. Other wives don't have to watch their sisters live the life they should be living while they struggle to maintain dignity in a marriage that's going nowhere. Richard nodded along, adding statistical support to Sandra's emotional arguments. She's right, man. I see how other couples live, and what Sandra is dealing with isn't normal. She's been patient, she's been supportive, but there comes a point where patience becomes enabling. Maybe she's right to expect more. I sat there listening to them dissect my failures with clinical precision, each taking turns to explain why my love wasn't enough, my effort wasn't sufficient, and my presence in Sandra's life might actually be holding her back from the happiness she deserved. They made it sound like the kindest thing I could do would be to disappear. The conversation ended with Sandra keeping the necklace, not because she wanted it, but because throwing it away would be wasteful, and we couldn't afford to waste anything. Richard offered to help me understand women better, by taking me shopping and teaching me what Sandra actually liked. Both acts of apparent mercy felt like deeper humiliations. That night, as I lay in bed next to a wife who had turned away from me in every sense, I heard whispered conversation from the living room. Sandra and Richard were discussing the evening, analyzing my reactions, and planning how to help me become a better husband. Their voices carried the intimate tone of conspiracy, the shared understanding of two people united in managing a difficult situation. I realized then that my marriage had become a project they were working on together, with me as the problem to be solved rather than the partner to be loved. Every failure on my part brought them closer together in their shared frustration. Every inadequacy I displayed gave them more to discuss, more to analyze, and more reason to see themselves as the reasonable adults dealing with an unreasonable situation. The 3 years of what I thought was faithful endurance in a difficult marriage was actually 3 years of being slowly replaced in my own life by a man who understood my wife better than I did, provided her with emotional support I couldn't offer, and promised her a future I couldn't deliver. Richard wasn't just my best friend living in our spare room, he was my understudy, learning my role and waiting for his chance to take the stage. What I didn't know was that my grandfather was watching this entire performance, taking notes on how Sandra and Richard revealed their true characters when they thought I had nothing to offer them. Every cruel word, every manipulation, every moment they chose selfishness over love, was being recorded not by surveillance devices, but by the careful observation of a man who had built an empire by understanding human nature. The test wasn't just about my character, it was about theirs, and they were failing spectacularly. The months following our anniversary became a masterclass in psychological warfare, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I thought I was experiencing the normal struggles of a marriage under financial stress. I didn't realize that Sandra and Richard had begun implementing a systematic campaign to break down my self-worth and prepare me for replacement. The morning routines became exercises in humiliation disguised as domestic necessity. Sandra would wake up and immediately begin listing everything I had done wrong the previous day, everything I needed to do better today, and everything I was failing to understand about our situation. "Joseph, you left dishes in the sink again. Do you think I'm your maid?" Richard noticed it too, and he's embarrassed for both of us. Richard's presence in these morning briefings was always positioned as coincidental, but I began to notice he was always dressed and ready for the day while I was still in pajamas, always prepared with coffee while I was still trying to wake up, always ready with solutions to problems I didn't know existed. He had somehow become more organized in my own home than I was. "You know what your problem is, buddy," Richard would say, settling into what had somehow become his chair at our kitchen table. "You don't anticipate Sandra's needs, you wait for her to ask for things instead of thinking ahead. Watch how I handle this." He would then demonstrate some small act of service, bringing Sandra her favorite mug, adjusting the curtains to let in morning light, or offering to run an errand she hadn't yet mentioned needing. Sandra's reactions to Richard's demonstrations were always grateful and pointed. "See, this is what I mean about paying attention. Richard notices things. Richard thinks about what would make my day easier. This is what partnership looks like." Her praise for Richard wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. It was meant to show me exactly how inadequate I was in comparison. The emotional manipulation intensified when Sandra began sharing details about our private life with Richard, always framed as seeking advice for our marriage, but actually designed to create intimacy between them and exclusion for me. "Richard, can you help me understand something? Joseph seems to think that just loving me should be enough, but I need practical support, emotional intelligence, someone who actually listens to what I'm saying." These conversations happened in front of me, but about me, as if I wasn't capable of participating in discussions about my own marriage. Richard would respond with thoughtful analysis of Sandra's needs, psychological insights into my behavior, and suggestions for how she could cope with the frustration of being married to someone who just didn't get it. "Sandra, you're not being unreasonable," Richard would assure her. "You married Joseph expecting growth, development, partnership. It's not your fault that he seems stuck in this pattern of mediocrity. The question is, how long do you keep waiting for someone to become who they're never going to be?" I found myself living in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the next criticism would come, never sure if my attempts to improve would be acknowledged or dismissed as too little, too late. Every gesture I made was compared unfavorably to something Richard had done better. Every conversation I tried to have with Sandra was interrupted by Richard's more insightful perspective. Every moment of connection I sought was redirected toward the triangle they had created. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating part. Sandra gradually stopped including me in decisions about our life, explaining that she needed to protect our relationship by not burdening me with choices I might get wrong. Richard became her consultant for everything from grocery lists to social plans, while I became the person who executed their decisions without input. "Joseph, Richard and I thought it would be good for us to have dinner with Juanita and her husband this weekend," Sandra would announce. "Richard pointed out that we haven't been maintaining important relationships because we've been so focused on our problems. He's right, we need to think bigger picture." I would arrive at these social gatherings to discover that Sandra and Richard had coordinated their stories about our life, our struggles, and our future plans. They presented themselves as a team managing a difficult situation, while I appeared to be the situation being managed. Juanita would offer sympathy to Sandra for her patience, praise Richard for his loyalty, and barely acknowledge my presence except to ask how I was holding up. The physical intimacy in my marriage died slowly, and then suddenly, Sandra began explaining that she needed emotional connection before physical connection, and that my emotional intelligence wasn't sophisticated enough to create the connection she needed. "Richard understands this," she would say. "He knows that women need to feel heard and understood before they can feel desire. You just don't have that level of emotional development." I would lie in bed next to my wife, listening to her talk to Richard on the phone about their day, their thoughts, their plans, their feelings. Conversations that used to happen between Sandra and me were now happening between Sandra and Richard, while I became the audience to my own replacement. The cruelest moments came when Sandra would occasionally show me affection, but only in contrast to some inadequacy she was pointing out. "I do love you, Joseph, but love isn't enough. Richard makes me feel understood. Richard makes me feel valued. Richard makes me feel like my thoughts and feelings matter. You make me feel like I should be grateful for the basic minimum." I began to question everything about myself, my worth, my perception of reality, my understanding of love and marriage. Maybe Sandra was right that I was emotionally underdeveloped, maybe Richard was right that I wasn't meeting her needs, maybe I was lucky they were both so patient with my inadequacy. The gaslighting was so gradual and so complete that I started apologizing for things I hadn't done, accepting blame for problems I hadn't created, and feeling grateful for treatment that should have been unacceptable. They had successfully convinced me that their cruelty was actually kindness, their betrayal was actually loyalty, and their manipulation was actually love. What I didn't know was that my grandfather was documenting every moment of this psychological abuse. He was watching how Sandra revealed her true character when she thought she had power over someone. He was observing how Richard demonstrated his complete lack of loyalty when it served his interests, and he was noting how I maintained my dignity, kindness, and hope even under sustained attack on my worth as a human being. Every day I survived their treatment was another day I proved I deserved what was coming. Every moment I chose love over revenge was another moment I demonstrated the character my grandfather hoped to find in his heir. The test was almost complete, and I was about to discover that surviving hell was just the beginning of my real story. The beginning of the end started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I had come home early from my part-time job at the hardware store, a position that barely covered our monthly expenses, but was the only work I could find. Sandra and Richard thought I wouldn't be back until evening, giving them freedom for the kind of conversation that would shatter the last illusions I had about my marriage and friendship. I entered quietly through the back door, planning to surprise Sandra with groceries I'd managed to buy with my employee discount. Instead, I found myself frozen in the hallway, listening to a conversation that revealed the true nature of the relationship I'd been blind to for months. The lawyer said the divorce papers should be ready by Friday, Sandra was saying, her voice carrying none of the emotional weight such a statement should have. She sounded like she was discussing a business transaction. Once Joseph signs them, we can move forward with our plans without any complications. Richard's response was equally cold and calculated. Good, I've already put a deposit on that apartment we looked at, the one with the view of the park. Sandra, you deserve to live somewhere beautiful, not in this cramped space with someone who's never going to amount to anything. My heart stopped. Not just because they were planning my divorce, but because of how long they must have been planning it. The casual way they discussed logistics, the deposit on an apartment, the coordination with lawyers. This wasn't a recent decision born from frustration. This was a long-term strategy that had been unfolding while I believed I was fighting to save my marriage. I almost feel bad for him, Sandra continued, though her tone suggested the feeling was more theoretical than genuine. He really believes that love conquers all, that if he just tries harder, I'll suddenly become satisfied with mediocrity. It's actually kind of pathetic. Richard laughed, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times in friendship, but now recognized as mockery. The guy has no idea what's coming. He still thinks you're going through a rough patch that will resolve itself. He has no clue that you checked out of this marriage months ago. The hardest part, Sandra admitted, is pretending to care about his feelings when he does those little romantic gestures. Like that necklace on our anniversary. Did you see his face when I criticized it? He looked like a puppy that had been kicked. Part of me wanted to laugh, and part of me wanted to put him out of his misery right then. Their laughter filled the apartment, and I realized I was listening to two people who had been amusing themselves at my expense while I struggled to save a relationship that existed only in my imagination. Every conversation about improving our marriage, every discussion about working through our problems, every moment I thought we were building toward reconciliation, they had been performance art designed to keep me compliant while they planned my exit. When are you going to tell him about us? Richard asked, and I could hear movement, sounds that suggested physical intimacy that made my stomach turn. After the divorce is final, Sandra replied. I don't want him to be able to claim adultery or make things complicated legally. Let him think this is about his inadequacy as a provider, not about me finding someone better. It'll be cleaner that way. Smart, Richard agreed. Besides, it's not really adultery when the marriage has been dead for so long. You've been more like roommates than husband and wife for months. I've been more of a partner to you than he has. They discussed their future with the enthusiasm of two people planning a vacation, while simultaneously discussing my future like I was a problem they were solving rather than a person they were destroying. They had timelines, logistics, financial arrangements, and contingency plans. They had thought of everything except the possibility that I might discover their betrayal before they were ready to reveal it. The most devastating part wasn't even the infidelity or the planned divorce, it was listening to them analyze my psychology with clinical detachment, discussing my emotional responses like I was a lab rat in an experiment they were conducting. He's so desperate to be loved that he'll accept any explanation we give him, Sandra observed. Watch how he reacts when we tell him the divorce is for his own good, that we want him to find someone who can appreciate him properly. He'll probably thank us for setting him free. The guilt might actually kill him, Richard added with what sounded like anticipation rather than concern. He'll spend months wondering what he could have done differently, never realizing that nothing he could have done would have changed the outcome. We decided he wasn't good enough a long time ago. I stood in that hallway for almost an hour, listening to them dissect 3 years of my life like surgeons examining a failed operation. They discussed specific moments when they had manipulated my emotions, particular conversations where they had tag-teamed to undermine my confidence, and detailed strategies they had used to isolate me from any support system that might have helped me see their true intentions. Remember when he tried to talk to his old college friend Marcus about our problems? Sandra asked. And we convinced him that involving outsiders in our marriage showed a lack of commitment to working things out between us. He actually apologized for seeking advice, and promised never to do it again. That was brilliant, Richard agreed. We cut him off from anyone who might have given him perspective on how badly we were treating him. He started believing that his isolation was his choice, his loyalty to the marriage, instead of recognizing it as our control. They had studied me like strategists planning a campaign, identifying my weaknesses, exploiting my strengths, and systematically dismantling my ability to recognize their abuse as abuse. Every kindness I had shown them had been catalogued as proof of my weakness. Every sacrifice I had made had been recorded as evidence of my desperation. Every moment of love I had offered had been analyzed as manipulation opportunity. The conversation eventually moved to other topics, including their excitement about spending what they believed would be Sandra's inheritance when my grandfather died. They assumed that as my wife, Sandra would inherit whatever wealth the family might have, despite the supposed disownment. They had been planning not just my personal destruction, but my financial destruction as well. Even if the old man left Joseph nothing, Sandra speculated, there might be life insurance, property, something we can claim as his widow. And if Joseph is too devastated by the divorce to fight for anything, even better. As I listened to them plan my complete destruction, personal, financial, and emotional, I felt something inside me change. Not break, but transform. The love I had been clinging to despite all evidence that it was unreturned finally released its grip on my heart. The loyalty I had maintained, despite all evidence that it was undeserved, finally acknowledged its own foolishness. But strangest of all, I felt relief. Relief that I was finally seeing the truth. Relief that I could stop trying to save something that had never existed. Relief that the people who had been torturing me had finally revealed themselves completely. I quietly left the apartment and didn't return until late that evening, acting as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I knew who they really were now, and soon, they would discover who I really was. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Sandra and Richard were still asleep in what had become their shared bed, though they maintained the pretense that Richard was just crashing on the couch when I was around. My phone rang at exactly 7 a.m., and the voice on the other end was one I hadn't heard in 3 years. Joseph, this is Harrison Blake, your grandfather's attorney. Thomas Montgomery passed away peacefully in his sleep last night. The will reading is scheduled for this afternoon at 2 p.m. Your presence is required. I stood in our tiny kitchen, holding the phone with hands that had begun to shake, not from grief but from the sudden understanding that everything was about to change. My grandfather, the man who had supposedly disowned me for marrying beneath my station, the man whose rejection had shaped 3 years of poverty and humiliation, was dead, and I was being summoned to hear his final words. Sir, I managed to say, I think there might be some mistake. My grandfather cut me off years ago. I can't imagine why my presence would be required at the reading of his will. Harrison Blake's chuckle was warm and knowing. Mr. Montgomery, there's quite a lot you don't understand about your grandfather's intentions. I think you'll find this afternoon very enlightening. Oh, and Joseph, you might want to bring Sandra. She'll want to hear this too. I hung up the phone and stood there processing what I'd just learned. My grandfather was dead, but somehow I was still connected to his estate. The will reading required my presence, and the lawyer had specifically mentioned Sandra. None of it made sense based on what I thought I knew about my family situation. As I stood there trying to understand what was happening, Sandra emerged from the bedroom wearing Richard's shirt and nothing else. She stopped when she saw my face, immediately shifting into concerned wait. Femurd despite having spent the night in another man's arms. Joseph, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. My grandfather died, I said simply. The will reading is this afternoon. Sandra's expression changed instantly from fake concern to barely concealed excitement. The will reading? Does that mean? She caught herself before finishing the thought, but I knew what she was thinking. Even though my grandfather had supposedly disowned me, she was hoping there might be something left, some financial windfall that would solve all the problems my inadequacy had created. I don't know what it means, I replied honestly, but the lawyer specifically said you should come too. Richard appeared in the doorway, clearly having been listening to our conversation. That's interesting, he said, trying to sound casual while obviously calculating possibilities. Even if the old man cut you off, there might be some family money, insurance policies, property that got overlooked. I watched them exchange glances, saw the silent communication passing between them, and realized they were already strategizing how to manage whatever inheritance might be coming my way. They thought they were about to hit the lottery, with Sandra positioned as my wife to claim whatever I inherited, and Richard positioned as our financial advisor to help manage our sudden wealth. What they didn't know was that my grandfather's death had been expected for months, and that the will they were about to hear had been carefully crafted not just to distribute wealth, but to reveal truth. Thomas Montgomery had spent 3 years watching how the people in my life treated me when they thought I had nothing, and he had designed his final act to expose everyone's true character in the most dramatic way possible. The law office of Blake Morrison Associates was more impressive than I had expected, occupying the top 3 floors of one of the city's most expensive buildings. As we rode the elevator to the 40th floor, Sandra gripped my hand with what appeared to be supportive affection, but felt more like possessive anticipation. Richard maintained his role as concerned best friend, offering quiet reassurance about whatever we might face. "No matter what happens in there," Sandra said, squeezing my hand, "we're in this together. Your family's problems don't change what we mean to each other." Richard nodded in agreement. "Absolutely, buddy. Rich or poor, we're here for you. That's what real friends and family do." Their performance was flawless, and if I hadn't overheard their conversation planning my divorce and their future together, I might have been moved by their apparent loyalty. Instead, I recognized their words as preparation for whatever they thought they were about to inherit. The conference room was larger than our entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a polished mahogany table that could seat 20 people. But we weren't alone. Around that table sat people I had never seen before, all dressed in expensive suits, all studying me with intense curiosity. Harrison Blake introduced them as representatives of Montgomery Industries, the oil and gas conglomerate my grandfather had built from nothing. There was the chief financial officer, the chief operating officer, the head of legal affairs, and the managing director of the family trust. Sandra's eyes widened as she began to understand the scope of what we were dealing with. "Before we begin the formal reading," Harrison Blake announced, "I need to provide some context that will help everyone understand Thomas Montgomery's final wishes. For the past 3 years, Mr. Montgomery has been conducting what he called the character test, designed to evaluate not just his grandson Joseph, but everyone in Joseph's life." My heart began to pound as I realized what was coming. The supposed disownment 3 years ago was entirely fictional. Joseph was never cut off from the family fortune. Instead, Thomas Montgomery created an elaborate scenario to observe how Joseph would handle adversity and, more importantly, how the people around Joseph would treat him when they believed he had nothing to offer them. Sandra's face had gone pale. Richard was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly, his knuckles were white. Every financial struggle Joseph has experienced over the past 3 years was carefully orchestrated. The family paid his rent through shell companies, ensured he had employment opportunities, and monitored his living situation to make sure he was never in actual danger. But they also watched everything else. Harrison Blake opened a thick folder and began removing photographs, recordings, and documents. They watched how his wife Sandra treated him when she believed he was financially worthless. They documented her emotional abuse, her manipulation, her systematic destruction of his self-worth, and her extramarital affair with Richard Collins. Sandra tried to speak, but no words came out. Richard looked like he was about to be sick. They watched how his best friend Richard betrayed him, moved into his home, stole his wife's affections, and actively participated in psychological warfare designed to drive Joseph to suicide or abandonment of the marriage. The photographs Harrison Blake placed on the table showed Sandra and Richard in compromising positions, the recordings played back conversations I wasn't supposed to have heard, and the documents detailed a paper trail of emotional abuse that had been carefully catalogued by Private investigators. But most importantly, Harrison Blake continued, they watched how Joseph himself behaved under extreme duress. Would he become bitter? Would he seek revenge? Would he abandon his principles when faced with betrayal and cruelty? Would he maintain his character when character seemed to be a disadvantage? My hands were shaking as I began to understand the magnitude of what had been happening around me without my knowledge. Thomas Montgomery's final conclusion was that his grandson Joseph demonstrated exceptional character, maintained his dignity under sustained attack, chose love over revenge consistently, and proved himself worthy of inheriting not just wealth, but the responsibility that comes with it. Harrison Blake removed a final document from the folder. The Montgomery Family Trust, valued at approximately $1.2 billion, passes in its entirety to Joseph Montgomery, along with controlling interest in Montgomery Industries, the family real estate portfolio, and all associated assets. Joseph also inherits his grandfather's personal estate, including the family mansion, art collection, and investment portfolio, valued at approximately $300 million. The silence in the room was absolute. Sandra was staring at me like she had never seen me before. Richard looked like he was going to faint. However, Harrison Blake continued, Thomas Montgomery also left specific instructions regarding the people who failed his character test. He turned to Sandra with an expression of professional contempt. Sandra Harrison. Montgomery, your marriage to Joseph Montgomery has been thoroughly documented as a pattern of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and marital infidelity. You have 30 days to remove yourself from any property owned by the Montgomery family. You will receive no spousal support, no division of assets, and no consideration in the divorce proceedings that Joseph is now entitled to initiate. Sandra tried to speak, to protest, to explain, but Harrison Blake continued without pause. Richard Collins, your betrayal of lifelong friendship for personal gain has been documented in detail. You have 24 hours to remove yourself from Joseph's life entirely. Any attempt to contact him, approach him, or interfere with his affairs will result in legal action for stalking, harassment, and fraud. Richard finally found his voice. Joseph, you can't believe this. We're friends, we're family, this is all some misunderstanding. But I was no longer the man who had entered this room an hour earlier. I looked at Richard with the calm authority of someone who finally understood his own worth. Richard, I heard you planning my divorce, I heard you laughing about my emotional reactions, I heard you strategizing how to destroy me psychologically. You're not my friend, you never were, and you're not family to anyone in this room. I turned to Sandra, who was crying tears that I recognized now as manipulation rather than genuine emotion. Sandra, you chose Richard over me months ago. You planned to divorce me and steal whatever inheritance you thought I might have. You treated me like a servant in my own home while sleeping with my best friend in my own bed. The marriage you destroyed was already over, I just didn't know it yet. Harrison Blake handed me a set of keys, documents, and credit cards. Joseph, your grandfather left one final message for you. He played a recording of Thomas Montgomery's voice, speaking words that sounded like they came from beyond the grave. Joseph, if you're hearing this, it means you passed the test. You maintained your character when character was all you had. You chose love when love seemed pointless. You remained kind when kindness seemed foolish. You are worthy of the Montgomery name, and you are ready for the responsibility that comes with it. Use this inheritance not for revenge, but for building the life you deserve with people who deserve you. The people who failed the test have revealed who they really are. Let them live with the consequences of their choices, but don't let their failures poison your future. You are my grandson, my heir, and my pride. Build something beautiful with what I'm leaving you. As we left the law office, Sandra and Richard were both trying to talk to me, to explain, to apologize, to negotiate. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about the beautiful life my grandfather had challenged me to build, and I knew it would be a life that included neither of them. The 3 years of hell were over. My real life was just beginning. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. Within 24 hours of the will reading, I had moved from our cramped apartment into the Montgomery family mansion, a sprawling estate that had been maintained perfectly during the 3 years I thought I was disinherited. Richard had packed his belongings and disappeared without a final conversation, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had tried to contact several news outlets with a story about inheritance fraud before being shut down by the family's legal team. Sandra's reaction was more complex and ultimately more revealing of her true character. Instead of accepting responsibility for her choices, she launched a campaign to convince anyone who would listen that she was the victim of an elaborate psychological manipulation. She claimed that I had known about the inheritance all along and had been testing her, that her affair with Richard was emotional support during a fraudulent marriage, and that the Montgomery family had orchestrated her destruction for their own amusement. The story might have gained traction if not for the comprehensive documentation Harrison Blake's team had assembled. 3 years of recorded conversations, photographed evidence, and witness testimony painted a clear picture of who had been manipulating whom. Sandra's narrative collapsed under the weight of evidence, but she continued trying to rewrite history even as she packed her belongings and searched for somewhere to live. "Joseph, you have to know this isn't who I really am," she pleaded during one of our final conversations. "I was stressed, I was scared, I felt abandoned by you and your family. People do terrible things when they're desperate. Can't you forgive me? Can't we start over now that everything has changed?" Looking at her, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity, not the kind of pity that leads to forgiveness or reconciliation, but the distant sadness of watching someone destroy themselves through their own choices. "Sandra, this is exactly who you really are," I replied calmly. "When you thought I had nothing, you treated me like nothing. When you thought Richard could give you more, you chose Richard. Now that you know I have everything, you want to choose me again, but love isn't a stock portfolio where you buy and sell based on market conditions." She tried to argue, to convince me that her feelings were genuine, that the inheritance didn't matter to her, that she just wanted us to be happy together. But her words carried the same manipulative tone I had learned to recognize over the past 3 years. She was performing love the same way she had performed loyalty, with just enough sincerity to be convincing and just enough calculation to be hollow. The divorce proceedings were swift and decisive. Sandra had no legal standing to claim any portion of an inheritance that had been mine all along, and her documented infidelity eliminated any possibility of spousal support. Her attempts to negotiate through lawyers were met with the simple response that she had already received everything she had earned from the marriage, the experience of revealing her true character. Within 2 months, Sandra had moved back in with her sister Juanita, whose reaction to the news of my inheritance was a fascinating study in regret and social climbing desperation. Juanita suddenly remembered how much she had always liked me, how she had always thought Sandra was making a mistake, and how the family had always hoped things would work out better for everyone involved. But I was no longer interested in the opinions of people who had judged me based on my apparent net worth. The Montgomery fortune came with something more valuable than money: the ability to see people's true motivations clearly and respond to them from a position of strength rather than need. The first few months of wealth were overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the material changes, though those were dramatic enough. The mansion, the cars, the staff, the business responsibilities, the social obligations, they all required adjustments to how I understood my place in the world, but the psychological changes were even more profound. For 3 years, I had been trained to second-guess my own perceptions, to accept other people's assessments of my worth, to apologize for taking up space in the world. Suddenly, I was running board meetings for a billion-dollar company, making decisions that affected thousands of employees, and being treated with the respect that had been withheld from me when I had nothing to offer but character. The learning curve was steep, but I discovered that the qualities that had sustained me through 3 years of emotional abuse were the same qualities that made me effective as a business leader. Patience, empathy, the ability to see past immediate self-interest to longer-term consequences, these weren't weaknesses as Sandra and Richard had portrayed them. They were strengths that had been tested under pressure and proven genuine. 6 months after the inheritance, I received a call from Harrison Blake with news that shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow did. "Joseph, I thought you should know that Sandra has been attempting to sell her story to various media outlets. She's positioned it as a cautionary tale about how wealth corrupts people, how the Montgomery family destroyed an innocent marriage for entertainment, and how you've become someone she no longer recognizes." I wasn't angry, just tired. "What do you need me to do about it?" "Nothing," Harrison Blake replied. "No one is buying the story because we've made the documentation available to any journalist who inquires. The evidence speaks for itself. But I thought you should be prepared in case she escalates her efforts." The escalation came in the form of a public confrontation outside the Montgomery Industries headquarters. Sandra had apparently spent weeks planning what she intended as a dramatic scene that would force me to acknowledge her version of events. She brought a small group of supporters, mostly friends who had been fed her narrative about being victimized by a secret billionaire who had pretended to be poor. When I emerged from the building that afternoon, Sandra was waiting with what she clearly intended as an audience for our conversation. "Joseph, I know you can hear me," she called out as I walked toward my car. "I know you think you've won something, but look what you've become. Look how money has changed you. The man I married would never have destroyed people's lives for entertainment." I stopped walking and turned to face her, not because she deserved a response, but because I realized this was my opportunity to close this chapter of my life definitively. "Sandra, the man you married never existed," I said, speaking clearly enough for her supporters to hear every word. "You fell in love with what you thought was my trust fund, not with me. When you thought the money was gone, your love disappeared too. When you discovered the money still existed, your love reappeared instantly. That's not love, that's a business transaction. She tried to interrupt, but I continued. For 3 years, you treated me like a servant in my own home while planning to divorce me and steal whatever inheritance you thought I might have. You had an affair with my best friend and laughed about my emotional reactions to your cruelty. You didn't destroy our marriage, you revealed that it never existed in the first place. Her supporters were looking uncomfortable as they began to understand that the story they had been told might not be complete. The money didn't change me, Sandra. The money revealed who I had always been underneath the poverty and humiliation you put me through, just like the money revealed who you had always been underneath the performance of being a loving wife. I got into my car and drove away, and that was the last time I ever spoke to Sandra face to face. A year later, I learned that Sandra had married a middle-aged businessman who had been attracted by her story of being wronged by a wealthy family. According to Juanita, who still occasionally tried to maintain contact with the Montgomery family, Sandra's new husband was kind, generous, and completely devoted to making her happy. I genuinely hoped it would work out for both of them, not because I had forgiven Sandra, but because I had moved so far beyond our relationship that her happiness or unhappiness no longer had any impact on my life. As for Richard, he had moved to another city and found work in sales, apparently telling people that he had been caught in the middle of a bitter divorce and choosing to rebuild his life somewhere fresh. I heard he was doing well, had met someone nice, and seemed to have learned something from the experience. I hoped that was true too, not for his sake, but because the alternative would mean that two people who had caused me tremendous pain had learned nothing from the consequences of their choices. 2 years after the inheritance, I met Juanita at a charity event. She had apparently spent considerable time thinking about what had happened between Sandra and me, and she wanted to share her conclusions. "Joseph, I owe you an apology," she said during a quiet moment between speeches. "I knew Sandra was having problems in your marriage, but I thought they were normal problems that couples work through. I had no idea how badly she was treating you, or that she was having an affair with Richard. I appreciated her honesty, but I was more interested in her insights than her apologies." Looking back, Juanita continued, "I can see that Sandra always struggled with being satisfied with what she had. She was always looking at what other people had and feeling like she deserved more. I think when she thought you were poor, she felt embarrassed by her choices, and when she discovered you were rich, she felt angry that you had tricked her. She could never just accept that love should be about the person, not their financial status." "People reveal who they are when they think the stakes are low," I replied. "Sandra revealed that her love was conditional on my net worth. That's important information, even if it was painful to learn." 3 years after the inheritance, I married a woman I met through the Montgomery Foundation's charity work. Dr. Emily Carter was a pediatric surgeon who had grown up in poverty, earned her education through scholarships and determination, and chose her profession based on her desire to help children, rather than maximize income. When Emily learned about my wealth, her reaction was neither excitement nor calculation, but concern about whether I would expect her to change her career or lifestyle to accommodate being married to a billionaire. When I assured her that I had fallen in love with who she was, not who she might become for my benefit, she smiled and said that was exactly what she had hoped to hear. Our wedding was small, attended by people who loved us for who we were, rather than what we represented. Harrison Blake was there, along with the senior staff of Montgomery Industries who had become friends rather than just employees. Emily's family was there, proud and happy without being overwhelmed by the wealth they were joining. Sandra was not invited, obviously, but I learned later that she had seen news coverage of the wedding and told people that she was happy I had found someone who could appreciate what she had never been able to see in me. I chose to take that statement as a sign that she had finally learned something from our experience together, though I suspected it was more likely just another performance designed to make her appear gracious, rather than bitter. 5 years after the inheritance, Emily and I had our first child, a daughter we named Grace after my grandmother, Thomas Montgomery's wife, who had died before I was born. As I held my daughter for the first time, I thought about the legacy my grandfather had left me, not just financial, but moral. He had taught me that character is what you do when you think no one is watching, but more importantly, that character is what sustains you when everyone is watching and judging you unfairly. He had shown me that the people worth loving are the people who love you when you have nothing to offer but yourself. And he had proven that the most valuable inheritance isn't money, but the wisdom to use whatever power you have in service of something greater than your own immediate gratification. As I looked at my daughter, I promised her that she would grow up knowing she was loved for who she was, not what she might achieve or acquire. And I promised myself that when the time came, I would find a way to test the character of the people in her life, not through deception and manipulation, but through the example of how love should look when it's genuine. The story that began with betrayal and humiliation had become a story about the difference between love and transaction, between character and performance, between the people who lift you up and the people who tear you down for their own entertainment. I had learned to tell the difference, and that knowledge was worth more than any inheritance my grandfather could have left me.